You are listening to the Keep the Weight Off podcast with Dr. Angela, episode number 98.
Welcome to the Keep the Weight Off podcast, where we bust all the dieting myths and discover not just how to lose weight, but more importantly, how to keep it off. We go way beyond the food, and we use science and psychology to give you strategies that work. And now your host, Dr. Angela Zechmann.
Welcome to the podcast this week. Today and next week, I have a very special guest. Her name is Dr. Ashley Gearhardt, and she is one of our premier researchers here in the United States in processed food addiction. You are going to love our conversation today. She just blew me away with her knowledge, and there are a lot of ahas from this interview. I'm actually still kind of high from all of the insights that she had. So Dr. Gearhardt is an associate professor of psychology in the clinical science area at the University of Michigan. She received her PhD in clinical psychology at Yale University with training on the underpinnings of both excess food and alcohol consumption. Dr. Gearhardt currently investigates the contribution of reward dysfunction, in other words, craving and liking, to eating-related problems across the lifespan. She uses a multi-method approach to explore the factors that contribute to problematic eating behavior. These factors can be neurobiological, meaning actual brain chemistry, behavioral factors, meaning the things that we do, or there can be psychological factors involved. Dr. Gearhardt also investigates the role of addictive processes in compulsive overeating and is the director of the Yale Food Addiction Science and Treatment Lab, which is also known as the FAST Lab at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. As a pioneer in the field of food addiction, she created the Yale Food Addiction Scale, which has been cited over 1,000 times and has been translated into over 10 languages. Her research has received funding from the National Institutes of Health and the American Heart Association. She has published over 150 peer-reviewed articles, and her research has been featured on media outlets including the New York Times, ABC News, The Today Show, and Time Magazine. I'm absolutely thrilled that she said yes to my request to be interviewed on this podcast. We've broken the interview up into two parts. And so without further ado, here is part one of my interview with Dr. Ashley Gearhardt. So welcome to the Keep the Weight Off podcast, Dr. Ashley Gearhardt. I am so happy that you agreed to be on this podcast. I'm just absolutely thrilled to have you here.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm happy to join.
So I talk about the addictive nature of processed food all the time, not only on this podcast, but with my patients. And when I read your most recent article, I assume it's your most recent article. You're so prolific that there might have been something since, but I'm talking about the November article that came out in the journal Addiction, indicating that processed food meets the criteria for addiction in the same way that nicotine does. Mm-hmm. And that's when it occurred to me, I got to ask you to be a guest on the podcast because you have some intel here that most people do not get. And I would say most people, even in the field of obesity medicine, right? So, so I've been just sort of silently watching you over the last few years because I really was interested in the Yale Food Addiction Scale that you developed. And I heard Kelly Brownell speak one time, and this is way back in like 2005. And he's one of your advisors. Was he an advisor for you on that?
Yes, he was. Kelly was one of my doctoral advisors, and I owe him so much. He's incredible.
He is. He's awesome. And just as a little bit of background for you, this conference was at Harvard, and he was part of a panel. And one of the people on the panel was a woman named Shelley. I can't remember her last name, but she was from McDonald's.
Oh,
and
interesting.
They were talking about food marketing to children. And she was saying, Ronald McDonald teaches. Ronald McDonald does not urge children to eat. And Kelly was just like railing Dr. Burnell, I should call him Dr. Burnell, was just railing into her. And she's like, today's my birthday. Can you have...
Yeah, Kelly is totally going to call it like he sees it and not let that go.
It was so great. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was so fortunate. I mean, I feel like there's so many people who, especially with this idea of really wanting to pursue in my career, the idea that, these highly processed foods could be addictive. It was when I started grad school. I started grad school in 2005, 2006. Geez, I can't remember anymore. And, it really was a very, very small slice of science. And I was really fortunate. I had an addiction. I came in to study alcohol addiction with Will Corbin, who was my other advisor, who's fantastic. And then got to know Kelly and the work on food. And I really was just seeing everything I was learning about the addiction mechanisms in my alcohol lab, really applying to what I was learning about food and eating and obesity. And clinically, I'm a clinical psychologist. I was treating people who had bulimia nervosa, who had binge eating disorder. I was doing evaluations for people getting ready to go into bariatric surgery. And I just was seeing all of these parallels emerge. And I was like, how far does this go? Right? Like, is this really truly an addiction? Because that changes so much of the dominant narrative that I feel like I was hearing in society that I think is still pretty dominant today, which it's just willpower and it's just, calories in, calories out. It's not about the food. It's just about your ability to resist. Right. And instead thinking, there's these $1 trillion industries that are designing, and they'll say they're designing these foods to induce moorishness, where you want more and more and more, and, hit your bliss spot and have maximum craveability. I mean, all those are synonyms for addiction. So when I said, hey, I want to really chase this down, both Will and Kelly were so incredibly supportive of me. And my first year of grad school, I really pivoted to that. And I will be grateful to them for forever and ever. They were amazing and continue to be amazing.
Yeah. Just as an aside, I have a friend who calls these types of foods momentum foods. Ooh. He's like, you get momentum going on them and then you can't stop.
I think that's such a good point.
Brilliant. Like, can I steal that? And he said, absolutely.
I think that's so, to me, when I think about what's the difference sometimes between things that are and are not addictive, it kind of is really tapping into that. Like a glass of water, right? You have a great big glass of water and it satiates your desire for more water, right? The need is kind of met. It's not like one big glass of water makes you want a second and a third and a fourth. Whereas if you have a delicious margarita or a big, glass of wine, you can have one. And for many people, that primes more and more and more. It's about priming additional wanting, additional desire, rather than diminishing that. So when I think about something like a big complete bowl that has whole grains and protein and veg in it, you eat that and you can really trust your satiety signals and your hunger signals. A big bowl of ice cream, the more you eat, you kind of are like, well, the ice cream container looks a little uneven. Maybe I need a little more of a scoop in here. It just leads you going back for more.
I've done that with brownies.
Cakes. But not so often with the salad container. You're not like, well, the romaine looks a little off now. I need another, so there's just these different experiences we have with the different foods.
Exactly. So we're talking about highly processed foods here that trigger a dopamine response in the brain, which is the pleasure signal. How do you define processed foods? I mean, is there a spectrum of addictive potential, or are certain things more addictive than other things, or how does that work?
It is such a tricky question, and it's one that the field, it's been interesting. I think we've moved from a bit of a spot of saying, oh my gosh, there can't be addictive processes in eating. And now we're like, well, there's clearly processes that we see in addiction that are contributing to difficulties with eating and food intake. I mean, some of the most recent medications are medications like naltrexone and bupropion, which are addiction medications that work on the reward system. And now we're kind of into, well, can certain foods really be addictive? And if so, how do we kind of put a boundary around those foods that can or cannot be? And what the right term is, or the right spot to really define it, is, I would say, still up for debate, even though I'd say we all kind of all know the foods we're talking about, right? Like junk foods is generally, I feel like, the term. And for me, when I try and operationalize it, I look at that as foods that have refined carbohydrates, like sugars and processed starches and flours, and or added fats are in the food substance. And how I often think about it is, when we look at our research, it's these foods that don't really exist in nature. Like, we see that people really like things like watermelon, but that they won't sit down after a bad day and eat a whole watermelon until they throw up, right? Whereas even like a stale bag of cookies, people will be eating this being like, this doesn't even taste this great, but I'm still shoveling it away in my mouth. And then what we see is that the carbohydrates and the fats that were really designed to find rewarding and engaging and motivating in these kind of processed food substances that exist in our environment now, they've been stripped down and altered and refined in such a way that they rapidly deliver carbohydrates and fats and packages and at levels that we were never designed to handle. And so our brain, when it has those refined carbs or those fats in these processed food substances, to me, that category is really where I think the risk lies. And that within there's dimensionality, just like there is with other addictive substances, right? Like we know, like a Bud Light, a low alcohol beer is less addictive than a shot of 151 fortified liquor. They're all, they all have ethanol, so they have an addictive potential. But in general, there is dimensionality. And I think that's true as well with these. I don't worry so much about naturally occurring whole foods, even if they're naturally high in fat, like salmon, or naturally high in sugar, like a banana. These are foods that we just don't see people typically finding prone to trigger these addictive responses. Whereas these processed, man-made, industrially created foods, that's where we see the problem.
And when you use the word dimensionality, then what you mean is like a gradation of response, basically.
You got it. So it's, I think people have a tendency to think of it in a very black and white way. Like it's addictive or it's not, or even your own response that there's addicts or there's not. We're starting to understand in the entire field of mental health that almost everything, it kind of falls along these gradients. Like if you think of anxiety or depression, all of us will feel a little anxious sometimes or a little sad sometimes. And there really isn't this clear black and white cutoff for when somebody goes from being just feeling a little anxious into clinical anxiety. It's more along the spectrum over time.
Yeah.
And I really think that that's similar. The more processed, the more altered, the more there's refined carbohydrates and fats that are rapidly absorbed into the brain. Now we're adding artificial sweeteners into everything, even caloric foods, and then all these flavor enhancers. So the more it's being altered and shaped and refined to be so intensely reinforcing, the more likely it is to trigger that response. Now, that still isn't for everybody. We know that with addictive substances, something like alcohol, let's say, about 90% of individuals will drink alcohol at some point in their lifetime, and about 15% will develop a clinically significant alcohol use disorder. So there's clearly an interaction between your individual risk factors as an individual and your exposure to an addictive substance. They kind of work hand in hand.
Right.
And then I always think that like I think there's like, it's a three-legged stool, your individual risk factors, the addictive nature of the substance, and then the environment in which you're operating in. Because I think with food, that's one of the most toxic parts about it is that, I talked to somebody recently who said, I've been addicted to food. I've been addicted to Xanax. And I got to tell you, after the Xanax withdrawal, it was pretty easy because I wasn't constantly exposed to triggers and, bottles and availability and ads. Whereas with the food, I am just constantly having to resist and be triggered, and it's exhausting.
It is exhausting. I couldn't agree with you more. I was just in the gym this morning and I was I was in I call it the dark cardio room because it's dark, but there's 4 TVs. One of the TVs was just constantly showing ads for food. And
Oh,
it was
yeah.
like, here I am working, to get healthy. And here it is. They're showing me all this, they're trying to trigger me. It's just made me mad.
Absolutely. You're so right. And there's so many more avenues now for the marketing,
Yeah.
especially to children and teens in ways that we would never tolerate. Something like, or not anymore, at least. I mean, tobacco used to do this. But now we've really if we knew alcohol, tobacco were targeting kids this aggressively, there would be this huge outcry. But we know the number one thing that kids are getting advertised are these highly processed junk foods that are damaging for their mental and physical health.
Yeah. I want to get into the effect on children a little bit more a little bit later. But I want to also ask you before I do that about, so you developed the Yale Food Addiction Scale, or do you call it the YFAS or the YFAS?
We call it the YFAS.
The YFAS, yeah.
I don't know why we decided
So I've just
that.
always called it the YFAS in my own head. But
is that funny?
so you developed that. And so my question is then, I kind of get a sense of why you decided to take the criteria for addiction and apply it to food. But I'm just curious, how did you do that?
Yes. So, it was very simple, to be honest with you. Like, we were trying to not recreate the wheel. It was more like the novelty was the idea. Like, I was at kind of the right spot at the right time of being in an addiction lab and in an obesity and food lab. And there was this, all these little hints out there from work from like Nora Volkow doing this amazing neuroimaging work, and Nicole Avina and Bert Hobel doing these animal model, all these just like little hints where people were starting to say, hey, I think addiction is playing a role in our current obesity epidemic. But I really realized at the time that how we were trying to identify people who might be experiencing that addiction was by doing things like having people just using somebody's body mass index, whether they had obesity or not. And I feel like there were a lot of problems with that, and that people can mask their relationship with food in a way that it doesn't show up in their body weight through dieting or restriction or vomiting or things like that. We also know there's many pathways in which somebody can end up with a body mass index of over 30. It's a multifaceted medical condition. And so we shouldn't just look at somebody's body shape and think we know what their relationship with food is like. And so I really wanted to say, well, it doesn't seem like rocket science to think, with drugs as disparate as nicotine to heroin to cocaine to alcohol, we use all the same diagnostic criteria of things like loss of control, continued use despite negative consequences, unable to cut down despite really wanting to. So let's just stick as closely as we can to those criteria and just really apply that to the context of these highly processed foods that are the foods that people report struggling to eat in moderation and being prone to binge eat.
So you developed the YFAS, and it's been used all over the world. And what kind of results do you see when you give this, I'm going to use the word test, it's not really a test, but when you give this assessment to people, what kind of results do you see? Like, are a bunch of us addicted? We don't know it.
So, it has been really great to see how widespread the scale has become, and the international interest as well, because we know issues with obesity and overeating and challenging relationships with food are not just in the United States, but all over the world.
We all have similar brains, right?
Totally. And now our food environment is really being, these processed foods are now being exported all over the world in a way which we're seeing these countries that are transitioning from minimally processed diets to the ultra processed industrial versions of these addictive foods. That as their food environment changes, we're seeing that is really tied with a propensity to have all these negative outcomes. And so, what we see is that about 14% of adults are meeting that kind of clinical cutoff for food addiction.
So close to alcohol then.
100%, really similar
Okay.
to alcohol and
Okay.
tobacco. So other legal, easily accessible addictive substances, the prevalence is very similar. This is based on big meta-analyses of tons of different studies.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think one of the most concerning things is that with children, it's at 12%. That is
12%?
12%, and that is unheard of. If we
Oh my
imagine
God.
if we were like 12% of children have an alcohol use disorder. Like this is not something, because you typically protect children and
Yeah.
teens, against marketing and accessibility and all these sorts of things.
Oh, this breaks my heart.
But we know that kids and teens, that the sorts of foods we're talking about that have this addictive potential is the main source of calories that they're getting. And they're the huge marketing target for the industry. So we know that issues around eating that start in childhood and adolescence have a tendency to track across the lifetime. So that's one of the most concerning findings for me. I also think it's important, going kind of back to that dimensionality idea that we were talking about, is that it with most people, even though at 14% isn't a small number, it's not everybody, right? But the average person is endorsing 1 to 2 symptoms of addiction in the way that they eat. And so
wait, when you say endorsing, what does that mean?
Meeting on the scale. So they're reporting, like they might not have this full-blown syndrome where they're like really clinically impaired and distressed, but they're reporting that pretty regularly every 5 days a week, they're having these like cravings for these foods that they just can't even focus on anything else. They have to go get their fix before they can focus on their work. Or their doctor is telling them, hey, you have prediabetes, and they're trying to cut down on their intake of sugar, but they're finding they're unable to pretty regularly. But maybe they're not at a level where you would say, oh, you need to go into treatment. And we can think about this with alcohol, right? We have people who are occasionally binge drinking. They might not have a full-blown alcohol addiction where it's really impairing their lives and they're really distressing, but they're drinking more than is optimal for their health.
Right.
And we see with things like alcohol, that's very widespread, and that a lot of the public health consequences of alcohol are not just from the relatively smaller group of people who have an alcohol addiction, but from the widespread group of people who are having like subclinical addiction symptoms and an addictive pull to alcohol, that they're drinking beyond what is optimal for their physical and mental health, but they might not be on that extreme yet. So I think even if you don't have a full-blown clinical kind of food addiction where it's really impairing and distressing you, most people we know are eating, the pull of these sorts of foods leads us to eat 200, 300, 400 more calories a day than we need. And that over time, that sets us up to be at greater risk for excessive weight gain and diet-related disease, even if, we're not at this moment at such an impaired level. Even those widespread subclinical pull of these sorts of foods have really important public health consequences.
So that helps me to understand my experience a lot then, because I really struggle with, I call it my drug delivery system of choice. And I always talk to my patients about that, because some people are like, okay, I like soda, so it's the sugar and the caffeine. Or some of them are just more like, I like the refined flour, like I like bread and pasta or chips. So I say, identify what is your drug delivery system of choice. Well, for me, it's the combination of sugar and flour together. So it's like baked goods, like cake. And so I have found myself after party going into the trash can and pulling out cake that people haven't touched that's sitting on the top. And I'm like, that's really distressing and humiliating to me that I would do something like that. And yet it was like, it was cake and it shouldn't be wasted and nobody touched it. And, it was like, it was just pulling me. And so, but when I did the YFAS, I did not show addiction. I didn't show addiction to it, but still my experience with these foods is distressing me.
100%. And that goes back to that important point of like, it's not black or white. It's not like either I have a perfectly healthy, no issues relationship with these foods, which honestly, I have not met many people who are like, what? Oh, those rare people who are like, oh, I can sit there with a big box of donuts at the 9 a.m. meeting and they don't distract me at all. Like some people have that relationship. these foods are really engineered and designed to be appealing, to grab us, to challenge us. And they really use our most inherent evolutionarily biology against us. Like dying of famine was one of our biggest threats, and our reward systems were so shaped by really calorically dense foods to really wake up the dopamine system and make us want it and make us desire it and make us say, consequences, who cares? In this moment, I just want this so much. But the most rewarding foods for most of human existence were things like berries and hunting down some bison, and now it's double chocolate chunk ice cream or cake with sprinkles and tons of icing on it. And so it's not just a problem for that subsection of people where it's really fully started to take over their life. But in the same way now that we're seeing women aren't supposed to have more than one drink a day, men more than two. A lot of people, especially after the pandemic, are surpassing that. They may not be not going into work. They're still able to parent, but there's a little bit of that addictive pull that it is causing them some distress, and they know they should be drinking less, and they're struggling to get a handle on it. And so I also think we all each have kind of our individual triggers, and that's based on our own individual preferences. Like some of us are more sensitive to sweet, some to savory, and also our own specific lifetime memories. I mean, memory plays such a huge role in addiction. So, for example, cigarettes, all cigarettes have tobacco in them. They all have nicotine. They all have this addictive potential, but people get very attached to their specific brand of cigarettes, and they will not smoke. They will fight. They will pay so much extra to smoke their brand versus another brand, even though the other brand has nicotine, because the memories and the taste profile and the sensory experience of their specific brand of cigarettes, and it being coupled with that rush from the nicotine over and over again, that's what they want. And so I hear that a lot where it's like, I'm totally fine if it was, some cookies, but if it's salt and vinegar potato chips, watch out. And we see that broadly in the context of addictions, that it can be really personalized to your history.
I wonder how much of it might have to do with early exposure too.
100%.
I remember specifically, I worked with, I don't know if you know Linda Hyder-Ferry. She is one of the premier researchers in nicotine addiction. And I worked with her in smoking cessation at Loma Linda. And I had a guy who told me, because one of the questions we always ask was, when did you start smoking? And he said, I smoked corncob pipes with my grandfather when I was 3. And I distinctly remember, that was just so much joy for me at the age of 3. And now here he is, 75 years later, and, he's had amputations and all of this. And he's been struggling with that addiction his entire life. And so, I can envision if you were fed Oreos, or if you were fed, like for me, it was cakes, that you might have certain propensities towards certain types of, that makes sense to me.
Absolutely. I mean, I think childhood is a time where we know generally people are more vulnerable to addictive substances. Like the neuroplasticity is so much more there. Our reward system is particularly sensitive. Our inhibitory control systems are not as well developed. Those really key memories that you make and associations.
So neuroplasticity, for people who don't know, it means like how the brain can adapt. Is that basically a good way of putting it?
Yeah, that the brain is kind of changing and altering, and those really big moments that it can really stamp into the brain. Oh, wow, I remember this rush of pleasure, or being with my grandpa and experiencing this pleasure, and that it really reminds you of so much. And, we know that there's a lot of marketing that is a focus of trying to associate, the industrial ultra-processed versions of these foods with things like going to a baseball game with your parents or the scoreboard at your local high school. And that it is it isn't by chance that it is so embedded into some of the most memorable moments of our development. That's really by design by the industry as an effective marketing strategy. And that is hard. And the good news about the plasticity of the brain is that the brain does continue to have plasticity across your whole life. And so one of the things we know is you're never going to necessarily get rid of that memory or that association that cake makes me happy, like cake brings joy. You can start to add on to that association. So you'll have that automatic instinctual, I want the cake will make me happy. And then you can add on to that and think, actually that I'm going to feel worse in 5 minutes, or this isn't going to nourish me, or you can add associations onto that to help yourself over time develop new habits and new memories. But I think people will often be like, I have to get rid of that desire or that expectation. And that can be really, really hard. And I think meeting yourself with compassion, that these have been stamped in for a long time, and think, how do you touch it now, can be helpful.
Yeah. We just got through the holidays, and I've been talking to patients over and over again about, well, grandma's holiday cookies, they mean so much to us. And, there are these embedded traditions. And so sounds like what you're saying then is, don't try to get rid of that association, just add to it and remind yourself, but when I eat grandma's holiday cookies, I end up binging on them, and I end up having all of these negative consequences. And so there's more to it than just the pleasure.
Yes, that's it. And that idea of, sometimes we'll work with people with addiction, and we do it with food too, where it's kind of this idea of urge surfing, that you're, knowing.
I've never heard that term before.
I really like it. That it's kind of more of a mindfulness term, of for so long it was okay, you're having this craving, and we need you to fight it, and talk and that can help to talk reminding yourself all the reasons why it's not going to be as fulfilling as you thought, or how you're going to feel 5 minutes afterwards, or reminding yourself what your values are and why your goals are, for why you're trying to have different healthy eating goals. All of those things can help. But there's also this skill of, we know that cravings come and they peak and they go down on their own. But often what happens is we start craving, we get to the tippy top peak of the craving, and we think, oh my gosh, I can't take this anymore. This is never going away. I need the cookie. And you eat the cookie. And then that makes it go away momentarily. And then it reinforces the cycle. So we'll have people kind of work on developing mindfulness strategies to just surf the urge, just to watch it go up and watch it come back down. And you don't have to try and force it to come back down. You don't have to try and force it to go away, but you just try and almost take a step back and go up on the observation deck and observe what's happening in your body and your mind. And okay, this is craving. Oh, I'm at a 6. Now I'm at an 8. This feels like this. Now I'm at a 10. I know it's not going to stay here now it's starting to go down to an 8. Now it's going down to a 4. And you start to learn that you can surf the waves of the craving, and that even if you do nothing at all, it will eventually come back down the other side.
Oh, that's so awesome. I love that. That is so great.
I do have to say, Angela, you and I have talked about this a lot when you and I have talked about my cravings, because, speaking from somebody who has been addicted to everything. I mean, I started out being addicted to sugar when I was very, very young as a child. And then it was nicotine, and then alcohol. And I do take naltrexone at this time. But I've done therapy, talk therapy, and a lot of other treatments. Great. But I don't do no caffeine, no nicotine, no alcohol, nothing. But by far, sugar is the hardest for me to manage. Sugar and flour. And it is a daily struggle. And Angela and I have talked about many times, what to do during those cravings, because those are the times that I've failed so many times during those urges. And so just listening to you guys talking about this, I mean, it's like the story of my life. But it's very, very interesting that Dr. Gearhardt, that you're talking about this, because Angela and I have talked about this many times when she's just talking about writing out the urge and that it will go away. Because when your mind is thinking if I don't get this, I'm going to die.
Yes.
And
totally.
It does.
You're all those circuitries.
Right.
Yeah. And the more you practice that, where you surf it, the more it strengthens that association next time. There's that little voice in there that there's still that part of you that's saying, oh my God, I'm going to die if I don't get this cookie right now. But there's also that little voice that's saying, no, you can do this. You did this last time.
Mm-hmm.
And that, we generally have this perspective that like self-control is a muscle and that it wears out. And there's some evidence for that, but there's also evidence that, and we see that generally people will do better if instead they kind of think of self-control as the more you use it, the more it works. So you kind of build on, okay, at that moment I used my self-control and even though it was the morning meeting and they brought in all the donuts, like I didn't have it. And that like that can empower you the next time to remind yourself that you can do that. And it builds on itself over time and what we call like a virtuous cycle, that like the more you do it, the more the next time you can do it again and remember your success, even little successes.
I really love what you're saying about creating the new associations. I mean, that is a real eye opener for me moving forward. Thank you for saying that, because that gives me some tools moving forward.
Yeah.
And one thing this is a little tip I learned recently that I had only found out about, is that sometimes I think when we're trying to resist, we rely so much on kind of these really taxing, like trying to talk ourselves out of it. That's why I kind of like the urge surfing. It's like, I just need to like sit back and put my hands up and try and watch this. But also this idea of sometimes doing distraction can help. Like in that moment, if you're starting to be at like a 7, 8, 9, 10 of your craving, sometimes your like brain almost short circuits, and trying to think through and trying to
right.
And so there's some evidence that doing something like smelling something that is contradictory to what you want, like smelling one of those candles that is like really intense, that sensory input from the candle can distract your brain from that. Watching videos on YouTube that are really sensory intense and visually stimulating, when we're craving, it's very visual in our brain. We're like imagining it, right? And so sometimes just having a sound or getting out of that context or doing anything else to fill the sensory space in your head with something that isn't that, imagining that cookie or that French fry, can help lower the craving in that moment. So then you have more tools in your toolbox at your disposal.
Very cool.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
This concludes part 1 of my interview with Dr. Gearhardt. Tune in next week for part 2. Take care and have a great week.
Hey, if you really want to lose weight and keep it off for good, your next step is to sign up for Dr. Angela's free weight loss course, where you're going to learn everything you need to get started on your weight loss journey the right way. Just head over to journeybeyondweightloss.com/free course to sign up. Also, it would be awesome if you could take a few moments and write a review on iTunes. Thanks, and we'll see you in Journey Beyond Weight Loss.